Hi everybody. In this video I'm going to talk about another form of government intervention, which is where the government decides to put in place a minimum price. This is where they're looking at a market and they decide that in this market the equilibrium price of P is too low. So they say that P is too low and they want to do something about that. There are two reasons that they might think the price is too low, two market failures. The first one is where they think that the producers aren't receiving enough money for the product that they're selling. So this is to help producers because they're not making enough income at price P. And this could be, for example, where we have the wheat market in the European Union. It may well be that in the European Union they want to have enough wheat production that's happening inside the EU. And if farmers aren't making enough income at P, and therefore they're going out of business or leaving the industry, then the EU won't be able to produce enough wheat. So in the EU they decide to put in place a minimum price. And they put the price in place above the equilibrium, because remember, they think the price at P is too low. So they say that by law, the minimum price that the product can be sold for is P min. And the price by law can't go any lower than that. Sometimes this is called a floor price. You can't go through this floor any lower. The other type of intervention would be, again, they think that the price of P is too low, and this is because they say that there's overconsumption at the price of P. Too much of the product is being consumed and it's generating negative externalities. So an example of this is that in Scotland they introduced a minimum price for alcohol. They thought people were drinking too much alcohol because it was in part because it was too cheap, and therefore they put in place a price of P min, and that meant that alcohol had to be sold at a minimum of this price, P min. In both of these cases, A and B, you can see on the diagram that when they introduce the price of P min, this is going to cause the demand to contract because people now have to pay a higher price. So they can't afford to buy as much, and we have a lower amount of demand at QD. Also, because producers are receiving a higher price, there's an extension of supply. So supply is increasing from Q to QS. And you'll be able to see that there's a problem here, that the quantity supplied is now greater than the quantity demanded. And this results in excess supply. There's too much now of this product being produced. In the case of A, in this situation, where the point of the minimum price is to make sure that the producers have enough income, what will happen is that the government will buy the excess supply. And this means that the producers are going to be able to sell this quantity of QS, and the government will buy it. Only QD is being demanded by consumers, but the government will buy the extra. However, if you're introducing the minimum price because you think there's overconsumption at P, the excess supply won't be bought by the government. So with this new price of P min, producers might want to supply QS, but only QD will be demanded, as long as there's nothing illegal going on, as we'll see. So now we can look at the positives and negatives of the minimum price intervention. The first positive is that the higher price for producers, so in situation A, will now be guaranteed. So they'll receive a higher price and it will be guaranteed. And also what this will mean is that there'll be an increase in their revenue. On the diagram, you can see that the revenue was P times Q. And now, because of the minimum price, they're going to be selling quantity QS at a price of P min. So it'll be P min times QS. So their revenue has increased, which is good for these producers, so it's had the desired effect. Secondly, in the case of B, where we've got overconsumption at price P, the positive is that there will be less consumption because now consumption is at QD instead of Q, and this will mean that there will be less negative externalities being produced. So for example, there are less people drinking alcohol if this is put on the price of alcohol in Scotland. However, there are going to be negatives as well. You can see very simply that the price will increase for consumers. So if we were talking about the price of wheat, and therefore that will feed through into the price of pasta and bread, for example, in the EU, that will mean that prices for consumers of those things will go up. So that's a negative. Also because their consumer surplus, as a result, will decrease. And we can look at what that consumer surplus is on here. The old consumer surplus at the price of P, remember you go along your demand curve to find this. This was the old consumer surplus, and we can label these corners. So the old consumer surplus was PBA, but now the consumer surplus has shrunk because the new price is P min. Therefore, it will be this area here. So the new area, we can label this corner, call this C. It's now P min CA. So the consumer surplus has decreased. The other thing as well is that this minimum price is distorting the price mechanism. This is not allowing the resources to be allocated using demand and supply. The government are intervening and they're artificially changing the price. So if you are a believer in the free market, you may well not like a minimum price because you'd say this is artificial and really the resources should be allocated using demand and supply only. The next thing that will happen is that we have a welfare loss for society. Again, looking at the consumer surplus, we saw that the consumer surplus got smaller. It went from PBA to P min CA. For the producer surplus was this area here. So the producer surplus changes from PBE to quite a different area. It will now be their selling quantity QD. It will now be this area here. This is a more complicated way of explaining the diagram. You don't have to talk about this net welfare loss, but it can be a more sophisticated way of describing your diagram. So the new producer surplus is P min C F E. What this means, if you look back at these, is that this area here and this area here have been lost, but they haven't been gained by the producer or the consumer. So this area, for example, has been lost by the consumer and nobody gains it. This area was lost by the producer and nobody gains it. So there's a net welfare loss equal to CBF. And that is bad for the allocation of resources. Another problem that we have that's specific to A is that the government have to buy up this excess supply. So the government must buy the excess supply, and this will lead to an opportunity cost. They could have spent that money on something else, for example, on education or roads or defence. There is an opportunity cost of that spending. The next problem that we're going to see in situation B, where we were putting the minimum price in place because there was overconsumption at price of P, is that now businesses are only going to be able to sell QD quantity because there's been this contraction of demand, so they can only sell QD. So this means that firms' revenue will fall. The revenue was P times Q, but now the revenue will fall to P min times QD. So there's less revenue for these firms, and that won't be good for them. However, there are some other problems which are related to this. It's possible that these firms, they're not supposed to sell for a lower price than P min, but they might actually break the law. They know that there are people willing and able to buy the product at a price below P min, and therefore a black market may develop. And this is where people are illegally selling the product below the price of P min, in which case it wouldn't be having this effect of decreasing the negative externalities, because people would still be buying possibly still the quantity Q. And so you can see that even though the government are intending to improve the situation, actually it may not change at all. And you have the problem of trying to police whether people are breaking the law. The final question, just to ask in general about this, is where should the minimum price be set? So where should P min be set? If this minimum price is too high, then the excess supply that government has to buy will be even higher. And also, if it's too high, there'll be even more incentive for a black market to develop and for people to illegally buy and sell below the price of P min.